Welcome back to Let's Tab 59. Bit of a pea super out here today, which is quite relevant really, because I want to talk about friendly fire, which could be attributed to the fog of war. And here we are on a foggy day out here. Friendly fire, well, we started to call it, people started to name it blue on blue. What was the reason for that? Well, back in the Cold War days, NATO was formed, obviously, having big exercises, manoeuvres out in West Germany. And NATO forces were always referred to as the blue forces. The flag, the NATO flag, the emblem is blue. And of course, the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact countries, they were red. They were the Red Army, or the Red Force, Blue Force and Red Force. I remember, though, we will often refer them to as Orange Forces, or the Orange Army, when we were out in Germany on these big NATO exercises. So, because we call ourselves Blue Forces, if there was an incident of friendly fire, if you like, it was called a blue on blue, and that's quite commonly referred to today. So, friendly fire incidents, obviously right back in the day when it was more hand-to-hand combat with swords and shields and maybe bows and arrows got involved, I don't know. But blue on blue didn't happen, obviously, very much. It's not recorded very much. But certainly when the armed forces started to get industrialised, and certainly in World War One, friendly fire instances began to happen. And in World War One, for instance, the artillery was used to create a creeping barrage. So the troops, the ground troops, would advance out of their trench systems across no man's land towards the enemy, and the artillery would put down a barrage, a line of fire in front of the advancing troops. And then as the troops were moving forward, so that barrage, then the guns would change their elevation and they would put down the fire and it would creep forward towards the enemy. And the idea being that it would keep the enemy forces' heads down and allow our troops to advance without coming under fire from the enemy. That was the theory. But of course, and maybe this is where the nickname drop shot comes from. Quite often the artillery didn't adjust in time, or the ground forces were moving too quick, or the artillery wasn't adjusted correctly. Whatever caused it, it used to cause, on occasion, friendly fire incidents, so blue on blue, and troops lost their lives or were injured. Now, not everything like that is a friendly fire incident. For instance, in 1942, so during the Second World War, many of you will know down in the West Country, Salisbury Plain area, is Imber Village. What they were doing down there was the RAF wanted to do a firepower demonstration using 6 Hawker Hurricane ground attack role aircraft. A bit like the Spitfire, the Hurricane. Not quite the same, but you know what I mean. It's a fighter aircraft. It had different roles, but it was in the ground attack role. And they wanted to show it firing and the firepower demo. So there was a lot of spectators down there. It was a little bit hazy on the day. The 6 Hurricanes came in and unleashed everything they'd got and ended up killing about 80 civilians and wounding a lot more. Now, that was covered up until about 2012. But that's not a friendly fire incident, because that wasn't them attempting to engage an enemy. They were just conducting, that's accidental. So that's not friendly fire. So that's where people can get the two mixed up. Friendly fire is definitely when one force or one weapon system or whatever is trying to attack an enemy, but mistakenly, for whatever reason, attacks their own troops. As I say, with the creeping barrage in World War One, the artillery there was not trying to kill its own troops. Obviously, it was trying to fire towards the enemy, but sometimes the troops got caught up in it. So that's the difference. And obviously, if troops shoot their own people on purpose, that's not friendly fire. Now, that became quite prevalent during the Vietnam War with the American forces, and it's often referred to as fragging. And there's many reports where maybe an unpopular officer in the unit, when a contact happened and they were engaging the enemy, somebody would drop a grenade, a frag, on their own bloke to kill him or shoot him maybe. So that's not friendly fire either. That is intentional, isn't it? Now, in the Falklands War, there was instances of friendly fire. And there's one which is they're all bad. But this particular instance was down to miscommunication and other things. So we'll go through it. What happened? Well, there was a Royal Navy ship, HMS Cardiff, and she was posted just off the islands, and she was put there in that position to ambush any incoming Argentinian aircraft that might want to attack our ground forces that were there on the ground in the Falkland Islands advancing. So the idea was park the ship up there. If the Argies come flying across, she'd pick it out. She'd got Sea Dart missiles and she could take on the aircraft. Now, it was quite a clear night, a moonlit night. A Gazelle helicopter from the Army Air Corps was going on a fairly routine job. It was 2 men on board. There was a staff sergeant and a lance corporal with the crew of the aircraft, of the Gazelle. They flew into a rebro station, I believe it was, to drop off some kit and pick up a couple of guys, which they did. They got there and picked up the 2 lads, dropped the kit off, and making their way back to wherever. When they got picked up on the radar system by HMS Cardiff, now, there was miscommunication. The Army hadn't said that this flight was going on. HMS Cardiff picked it up on their radar, assuming straight away that it must be Argentinian. In fact, they identified it. The crew on HMS Cardiff believed it to be a fixed-wing aircraft on their system. They even thought it might have been a C-130, a Hercules. And so they engaged with the Sea Dart missile. Well, the first missile missed, but the second one didn't. It hit the helicopter and brought it down, and the crew perished. And it was later investigated, and by the forensics looking at the wreckage, it was definitely hit by a Sea Dart, and that was from Cardiff, HMS Cardiff. Now, it's horrendous when anyone loses a family member, a loved one, or whatever in wartime. But to lose somebody to friendly fire when you know that it wasn't the enemy that killed your son, your husband, your brother, whatever, that it was your own forces, that's even worse, isn't it? Another obvious one that wasn't very pleasant either, none of them are very pleasant, but in January 1991, in the Gulf War, 2 Warrior armoured infantry fighting vehicles from the 3rd Battalion, the Royal Regiment Fusiliers C Company, it's call signs 22 and 23. They were parked up, they were advancing into Iraq. They had to sort of halt for a while, because I think the Royal Engineers were destroying some Iraqi guns that had been left behind to deny them back to the enemy. So they were doing a demolition job on that when an A-10 come over using Maverick missiles, misidentified the 2 Warriors and engaged them. Now, the Warriors had fluorescent marker panels on them, which would have been clearly visible. It was daylight, but they weren't. They weren't picked up by the pilot, and he unleashed his Maverick missile from about 8,000 feet. So he wasn't that close, but 8,000 feet, he should have been able to identify those ground call signs, those Warrior infantry fighting vehicles, especially with the marker panels on them. But he didn't, and he engaged them and destroyed them, causing loss of life. Very, very horrendous. So blue on blue happens. If you look at the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's a great example of what goes on. You see a lot of the Russian vehicles with a big white Z painted on the side. Is one of them, isn't it? A Z. And I think the other one was a V, was it? A V and a Z. So they mark their vehicles up, their armoured vehicles, all their vehicles with this Z or V marking. And mainly because, to try and stop blue on blue, because obviously the Ukraine armed forces had a lot of similar Soviet, or very same Soviet equipment, tanks, vehicles, that the Russians had. And so to distinguish the markings, they bang the Zs on. And they often see as well the soldiers with this, the Ukrainian soldiers with green sticky tape around their arms and around their helmets, or yellow or blue. Troops are really trying to identify, to stop this blue on blue happening. But it always does. It's always going to happen in every conflict. On D-Day, 6th of June, 1944, the Allied aircraft that went in, as you know, all the wings and the tail sections had these black and white stripes painted on them to identify those to the ground forces and the Navy, so they wouldn't get engaged by their own, of course, blue on blue. And that worked quite well. It was the It was the invasion of Sicily by the Allies in 1943, July 43, I think it was. Operation Husky, that was it, Operation Husky, 1943, Allied invasion of Sicily. The American ground forces and naval forces shot down, destroyed 30 C-47 cargo planes, transport planes. 30 of them got shot down by their own forces on the Sicily landings. That's a lot of aircraft, it's a lot of loss of life. 30. I mean, many of you veterans will remember we paid in the army, we paid a lot of time on AFV and aircraft recognition. You'd always have those lessons on armoured fighting vehicle recognition, looking at the Warsaw Pact countries' vehicles and aircraft in those days. Because if you was in the anti-tank platoon, the anti-aircraft, you had to know what vehicles were what, because it was very, very important. But even so, with all that training in place and with people putting marker panels on, you're still getting blue on blue. Going back to the incidents in the Falklands War with the Gazelle being shot down by HMS Cardiff, now our aircraft had a friend or foe system on board that would send out a signal to try and block friendly forces engaging their own systems. But apparently that was switched off because the friendly fire system on board the aircraft was causing problems with our Rapier, which is our anti-aircraft missile system at the time, our Rapier systems. It was causing them problems to activate. And so on that particular night, that Gazelle that got shot down by HMS Cardiff had its friend or foe system switched off. So even with technology, with marker panels, with training, with all this recognition, in the fog of war, like today, the fog of war, there's still mistakes made and friendly fire incidents occur. So that's a quick chat about friendly fire. If you're new to my channel, you haven't subscribed, please consider it. Help my channel grow this year. We're coming into 2025. I want to try and grow the channel as much as I can so I can get away and try and do some more stuff out of area a bit more. That's what I'm hoping to do in 2025, is to maybe go out to different places more and do video in more interesting places, but we'll see. So please consider subscribing if you haven't. Stay safe. Till next time, troops, and it won't be long. Remember, let's tab.